In the scorching heat of a frontier town, a pregnant teenager's desperate cry pierces through the crowd. "I'm giving birth today, please someone buy me." But when a broken mountain man steps forward with his last silver coin, neither realizes they're about to ignite a firestorm of corruption, betrayal, and violence that will shake this dusty settlement to its core. Will love triumph over prejudice, or will the forces of greed destroy them both? Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment below with your city so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered wooden platform that served as Millbrook's auction block, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the crowd that had gathered in the town square. Dust swirled in the oppressive afternoon heat, mixing with the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and the underlying stench of desperation that seemed to permeate every corner of this God-forsaken frontier settlement. Elias Kane stood at the back of the jeering crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his worn felt hat. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much and lost everything that mattered. His once powerful frame, now lean from grief and solitude, was draped in simple homespun clothes that had seen better days. The silver stubble on his angular jaw caught the harsh sunlight as he watched the proceedings with growing disgust. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, his words dripping with false enthusiasm. "Young, strong, and as you can see, already proven fertile." A collective laugh rippled through the crowd of rough-hewn men, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of cruelty and lust that made Elias's stomach turn. He had come to town for supplies, not to witness this travesty, but something kept his feet rooted to the spot. On the platform, a slight figure stood with shoulders squared in defiance despite the rope bonds that held her wrists behind her back. The burlap hood that covered her head couldn't hide the obvious swell of her pregnancy, nor the way she swayed slightly on her feet. Even through the coarse fabric, Elias could sense her terror and determination warring within her young frame. 30 silver, called out a burly man with a tobacco-stained beard. "I could use another hand in my fields, and this one comes with a bonus." The crowd erupted in raucous laughter, and Elias felt his jaw clench. 3 years of living alone in his mountain cabin had dulled his tolerance for human cruelty, but this spectacle awakened something fierce and protective within him that he thought had died with his beloved wife Sarah. 40 silver. Another voice joined the bidding, this one belonging to a man whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the cruel glint in his pale eyes. "She'll work off her debt in my establishment soon enough." "I hear tell she's a thief," someone shouted from the crowd. "Stole railroad bonds worth a fortune." "All the more reason to keep her close," the well-dressed man responded with a lewd grin. "I'll make sure she pays every penny back one way or another." The auctioneer's hammer was rising when a voice cut through the cacophony like a blade through silk. "I'm giving birth today." The young woman's desperate cry pierced the air with such raw anguish that it silenced the entire crowd. "Please, I'm begging you, someone buy me. Don't let them separate me from my child." The hood muffled her words, but the pain in them was unmistakable. She swayed dangerously on the platform, her breathing labored and quick. Even through the burlap, Elias could see the wet stains spreading down the front of her dress. "Well, I'll be damned," the auctioneer muttered, his showmanship faltering for the first time. "Looks like we got ourselves some excitement, folks." The crowd pressed forward, their voices rising in a crescendo of excitement and speculation. Some called for the auction to continue, others demanded to know if the child would be sold separately. The noise was deafening, but all Elias could hear was the echo of that desperate plea, "Someone buy me." Those 3 words hit him like a physical blow, transporting him back to another time, another place when his own Sarah had begged for help that never came. He remembered the way her hand had clutched his as the fever took her, the way she had whispered his name with her last breath while he stood helpless beside their bed. 60 silver. The well-dressed man's voice cut through Elias's memories. "And I'll take the whelp too when it comes." 70, countered the tobacco-stained farmer. "I can always use more workers." The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed as the bids escalated. This was turning into the most profitable sale he'd seen all month. On the platform, the young woman's legs buckled, and she fell to her knees with a cry of pain that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. That was when Elias moved. He pushed through the crowd with deliberate force, his broad shoulders clearing a path as men stumbled aside. His hand moved to the small leather pouch at his belt, all the silver he had left in the world, saved from 3 years of trapping and trading. 87 pieces of silver. The price of new tools, winter supplies, and a year's worth of provisions. The price of his own survival. 100 silver. His voice boomed across the square with such authority that every head turned in his direction. The crowd parted before him like water, revealing a man whose quiet intensity commanded respect even from these hardened frontier types. His dark eyes, usually soft with melancholy, now blazed with fierce determination as he strode toward the platform. "Well now," the auctioneer stammered, clearly taken aback by this unexpected development. That's quite a bid, stranger. You sure you got that kind of money?" Elias reached the platform and poured the contents of his pouch into his palm, letting the silver coins catch the sunlight. "Count it if you want, but I'm taking her now." The well-dressed man stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Now see here, mountain man, I was bidding on that piece of property." "Property?" Elias turned slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just call a woman property?" The threat in his tone was unmistakable, and the man took an involuntary step backward. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, sensing the shift in energy. This wasn't just about money anymore. "The bidding ain't closed yet," the auctioneer protested, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something about this stranger that made him nervous, something in those dark eyes that spoke of violence barely held in check. "It is now." Elias placed the silver on the platform's edge and pulled out his knife. The blade gleamed as he climbed onto the wooden structure, his movements fluid and purposeful. The young woman looked up at him through the burlap hood, her breathing rapid and shallow. Up close, he could see how young she truly was, barely more than a child herself, yet already bearing life within her. Her dress was simple but clean, or had been before this ordeal. There was something about her posture, even in defeat, that spoke of inner strength and dignity. "Hold still," he murmured gently as he cut through the ropes binding her wrists. "I'm getting you out of here." "Wait just a damn minute." The well-dressed man climbed onto the platform, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "I got rights here. I was bidding fair and square." Elias straightened slowly, the knife still in his hand. The blade was designed for skinning game, but it would serve just as well for skinning men, if necessary. "You got 3 seconds to step down and walk away." "You threatening me, mountain man?" "I'm making you a promise." The two men faced each other across the platform, while the crowd held its collective breath. The pregnant young woman knelt between them, her hooded head turning from one to the other as she sensed the violence crackling in the air around her. 1. The well-dressed man's hand tightened on his pistol grip. 2. As sweat beaded on the sand's forehead despite the afternoon heat, something in the mountain man's eyes told him this wasn't a bluff. 3. The man's nerve broke. He stepped backward off the platform, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Deputy Wade's gonna hear about this. You can't just come into our town and—" "I can, and I did." Elias sheathed his knife and gently helped the young woman to her feet. "The auction's over. She's coming with me." The auctioneer looked between the mountain man's silver and the angry crowd, his greed warring with his sense of self-preservation. Finally, he scooped up the coins and tucked them into his vest. "Sold to the gentleman from the mountains, and may God have mercy on all our souls." As Elias carefully removed the burlap hood, the crowd got its first clear look at the young woman's face. She was beautiful in the way that flowers are beautiful just before a storm, delicate features marked by exhaustion and pain, dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and eyes the color of autumn leaves that held depths of suffering no 18-year-old should possess. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. I thought they were going to—" "They're not going to do anything to you," Elias said firmly. "What's your name?" "Isabel. Isabel Martinez." She swayed on her feet, and he quickly steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. "I'm sorry, the baby's coming. I can feel it." The crowd was growing restless, their entertainment apparently over, but Elias could sense the undercurrent of hostility that ran through them like a poisonous river. These people didn't like being denied their spectacle, and they especially didn't like being shown up by an outsider. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he murmured, scanning the faces around them. "Is there a doctor in this town?" "Doc Mitchell's drunk again," someone called out with a harsh laugh. "But Mrs. Keene knows about birthing babies, lives in the boarding house on 3rd Street. "She won't help," another voice added cruelly. "Not for a thief and a whore." Isabel flinched as if struck, but Elias felt anger surge through him like wildfire. "Say that again," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the square. The man who had spoken, a thin, weaselly fellow with darting eyes, suddenly found himself the focus of every person's attention. I just meant that you just meant to spread lies about a woman you don't even know." Elias stepped to the edge of the platform, his presence somehow seeming to fill the entire space. "Maybe you should think before you speak next time." The crowd was beginning to disperse, the entertainment value of the situation rapidly diminishing in the face of the mountain man's protective fury. But not everyone was ready to leave. The well-dressed man had retreated to the edge of the square, where he stood speaking in urgent whispers with 2 other men. One of them wore a deputy's badge that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Elias helped Isabel down from the platform, supporting her weight. As another contraction racked her small frame, she bit back a cry of pain, her fingernails digging into his arm through his shirt sleeve. "How far apart are they?" he asked gently. "Close," she gasped. "Maybe 5 minutes. I've been trying to hold back all day, but—" "You can't hold back nature," he said simply. "Come on, let's get you to this Mrs. Keene." They made their way slowly through the dusty streets of Millbrook, Isabel leaning heavily on Elias's arm. The town was typical of frontier settlements, a collection of ramshackle buildings thrown together with more hope than skill, connected by muddy streets that would turn to dust bowls in summer and rivers of mud in winter. The boarding house on 3rd Street was one of the more substantial structures, a 2-story building with a wraparound porch and actual glass windows. Mrs. Keene turned out to be a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She opened the door to Elias's knock and took in the scene with a single glance, the mountain man supporting the obviously pregnant young woman, the tension in both their faces, and the way Isabel clutched her swollen belly. "Mercy," she said simply, stepping aside to let them in. "Bring her upstairs. 2nd door on the right." The room Mrs. Keene led them to was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. Isabel sank onto the bed with a groan of relief, her hands pressed against her back. "How long has she been laboring?" Mrs. Keene asked Elias as she bustled around the room, gathering supplies from a well-stocked cabinet. "I don't know, I bought her freedom at the auction." Mrs. Keene's hands stilled for a moment, and she turned to study his face with sharp eyes. "Did you now? And what's your intention with this child?" "To keep her safe," Elias said simply, "nothing more." Something in his tone must have satisfied her, because she nodded curtly and returned to her preparations. "You can wait downstairs in the parlor. This is women's work." "No." Isabel's voice was sharp with panic. "Please don't leave me alone. I'm scared." Elias looked between the 2 women, torn between propriety and compassion. Mrs. Keene made the decision for him with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, stay if you must. Won't be the first time a man's been present for a birthing. Just keep out of the way and try not to faint." For the next several hours, Elias learned more about courage than he had in all his years of facing down wild animals and hostile weather. Isabel endured each contraction with quiet determination, gripping his hand when the pain became overwhelming, but never crying out. Between the waves of labor, she told him fragments of her story. She had been living with her stepfather since her mother's death 2 years earlier. He was a cruel man with a weakness for drink and gambling, who had blamed her for every misfortune that befell their small household. When she discovered she was pregnant, the result of a brief, passionate affair with a young railroad worker who had moved on before learning of her condition, her stepfather had flown into a rage. "He said I was a disgrace to the family name," she whispered during a brief respite. "Said I'd brought shame on his house. But it wasn't until the railroad bonds went missing that he... She doubled over as another contraction hit, and Elias felt her fingernails dig into his palm. When it passed, she was too exhausted to continue the story, but he could guess the rest. Her stepfather had accused her of the theft to deflect suspicion from himself, and the local authorities had been all too willing to believe the worst of a pregnant, unmarried woman. "You don't have to talk about it now," he said gently, using his free hand to smooth the damp hair back from her forehead. "Just focus on bringing this baby safely into the world." Mrs. Keene moved around them with quiet efficiency, bringing hot water and clean linens, checking Isabel's progress with experienced hands. As the sun began to set outside the window, casting long shadows across the room, the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. "It's time," Mrs. Keene announced. "This baby's ready to meet the world." What followed was a symphony of pain and effort, of encouragement and determination. Isabel bore down with each contraction, her face flushed with exertion, while Mrs. Keene guided her through the process with calm authority. Elias found himself offering what comfort he could, a cool cloth for her forehead, words of encouragement, the solid presence of his hand in hers. And then, as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the window, a new cry joined the evening chorus. Mrs. Keene held up a small, perfect form, red and wrinkled and utterly beautiful. "A son," she announced with satisfaction, strong and healthy by the sound of him. Isabel collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Keene cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. When she placed the infant in his mother's arms, Elias felt something crack open inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart 3 years ago when Sarah died. "He's perfect," Isabel whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Look at him. He's absolutely perfect." The baby had stopped crying and was staring up at his mother with dark eyes that seemed impossibly wise for someone who had been in the world for less than 5 minutes. His tiny fist waved in the air, and when Isabel offered her finger, he grasped it with surprising strength. "What will you name him?" Mrs. Keene asked as she cleaned up the room. "Gabriel," Isabel said without hesitation. "Gabriel Martinez. It means God is my strength." Elias felt tears prick at his eyes, the first he had shed since Sarah's funeral. This young woman who had endured betrayal and abandonment, who had been sold like cattle in a public square, still had faith enough to see God's hand in her child's safe arrival. Mrs. Keene disappeared downstairs to prepare some broth, leaving Elias alone with Isabel and the baby. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of the infant's breathing and the distant noise of the town settling into evening. "I don't know how to thank you," Isabel said softly, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "If you hadn't been there today." "Don't think about that," Elias said firmly. "You're safe now, both of you." "But for how long?" She looked up at him then, and he saw the fear lurking behind her joy. "You heard what they were saying at the auction. They think I'm a thief, and Deputy Wade, he's not going to let this go. He's in my stepfather's pocket, has been for months." Before Elias could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs, made them both freeze. Mrs. Keene's voice drifted up from below, sharp with indignation. "You can't just barge in here. This is a respectable establishment." "Official business, ma'am. We got a warrant." Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving instinctively to his knife. Isabel clutched the baby closer to her chest, her face pale with terror. "The warrant's for Isabel Martinez." The voice continued, growing closer. "For the theft of railroad bonds and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." Deputy Wade appeared in the doorway, his badge glinting in the lamplight. He was a tall, thin man with a weak chin and cold eyes that held no trace of compassion. Behind him stood two other men, the well-dressed stranger from the auction and another deputy. "Well, well," Wade said with a satisfied smile. "Looks like we found our little thief. And in the company of her accomplice, I see." "I'm not her accomplice," Elias said quietly, but his voice carried a warning that made the deputy's hand drift toward his gun. "Maybe not," Wade acknowledged, "but harboring a known criminal is still a crime in these parts, especially when that criminal just gave birth to stolen property." "The baby isn't stolen property." Mrs. Keene's voice was sharp with outrage as she appeared behind the deputies. "That child was just born. You can't possibly—" "The child is evidence," the well-dressed man interrupted smoothly. "Born from funds stolen from the railroad. Everything this woman owns is forfeit, including any offspring." Isabel's cry of anguish filled the room as the terrible implications hit her. They weren't just going to arrest her, they were going to take her baby away. "Over my dead body," Elias said softly, and something in his tone made all three men take a step backward. Deputy Wade's hand closed around his pistol grip. "You threatening an officer of the law, mountain man? I'm making a statement of fact." Elias moved to place himself between the bed and the deputies. "You want to take that woman and her child, you're going to have to go through me." The tension in the room was so thick, it seemed to crackle like lightning before a storm. Mrs. Keene clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting between the men as she calculated the odds of violence erupting in her boarding house. "This doesn't have to get ugly," the well-dressed man said smoothly. "We just want what's ours. The woman stole $20,000 in railroad bonds. She needs to answer for that crime." "She didn't steal anything," Elias said firmly, "and you know it." "Can you prove that?" Deputy Wade challenged. "Can you swear under oath that this woman is innocent?" Elias opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He couldn't swear to anything about Isabel's guilt or innocence. He had only known her for a few hours, but he could swear to what he had seen in her eyes, the desperate love of a mother for her child, the quiet dignity with which she had endured her ordeal. "I can swear that she deserves better than this," he said finally, "and that baby is innocent no matter what you think she did." "The law doesn't care about your feelings," Wade replied coldly. "Miss Martinez, you're under arrest. You need to come with us now." "She just gave birth," Mrs. Keene protested. "She can't be moved for at least a week." "Then she'll recover in a jail cell," the deputy said callously, "and the baby will go to the territorial orphanage until this matter is resolved." That was when Isabel found her voice again. Weak as she was from childbirth, devastated as she was by the threat to her child, something fierce and unbreakable rose up within her. "No," she said simply. "You can arrest me if you must, but you will not take my son." "You don't have a choice in the matter," the well-dressed man said with cruel satisfaction. "A convicted criminal has no rights to—" "She hasn't been convicted of anything yet," Elias interrupted. "Last I checked in this territory, people were still innocent until proven guilty." Wade's face flushed with anger. "Are you questioning my authority? I'm questioning your humanity." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Outside, the sounds of the town continued, horses' hooves on packed earth, the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons, the normal rhythms of life that seemed impossibly far removed from the drama playing out in this small room. Finally, Deputy Wade seemed to reach a decision. "You got 24 hours, he said to Isabel. to recover enough to stand trial, but come tomorrow night you're coming with us, whether you can walk or not, and the baby goes to the orphanage." "You can't," Mrs. Keene began, but Wade cut her off with a sharp gesture. "And you," he said, turning to Elias, "better not get any ideas about running. We'll be watching this place all night. Anyone tries to leave, we shoot first and ask questions later." With that chilling promise, the three men filed out of the room, their heavy footsteps echoing on the stairs. Mrs. Bay Keene immediately went to the window and twitched aside the curtain. "There's 2 men stationed across the street," she reported grimly, "and I can see another one by the back entrance." Elias sank into the rocking chair beside the bed, his mind racing. 24 hours. That wasn't enough time to prove Isabel's innocence, even if he knew where to start looking for evidence. It wasn't enough time to plan an escape, not with a woman who had just given birth and a newborn baby. It wasn't enough time for anything except prayer. "What are we going to do?" Isabel whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her son close. "They're going to take him away from me. They're going to put him in an orphanage, and I'll never see him again." Elias looked at her, this brave young woman who had endured so much and still found the strength to fight for her child, and felt something crystallize inside him. For 3 years he had been drifting through life like a ghost, existing but not truly living. Sarah's death had broken something fundamental inside him, and he had retreated to his mountain cabin to nurse his wounds in solitude. But looking at Isabel and baby Gabriel, he remembered what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. "We're going to prove your innocence," he said quietly. "We're going to find the real thief and clear your name." "How?" she asked desperately. "In 24 hours, it's impossible." "Maybe," he acknowledged. "But impossible things happen sometimes. You gave birth to a healthy baby today, against all odds. That's pretty close to a miracle in my book." Mrs. Keene had been listening to their conversation with growing determination. Now she turned from the window with a fierce expression on her weathered face. "That stepfather of yours," she said to Isabel, "where does he drink? The Silver Dollar Saloon, mostly." "Why? Because men who drink too much often talk too much," the older woman said grimly, "and sometimes they say things they shouldn't." Elias caught her meaning immediately. "You think he might have bragged about framing her?" "Men like that can't keep their mouths shut when they're in their cups," Mrs. Keene said with satisfaction. "All we need is someone willing to listen." "That's still not proof that would stand up in court," Elias pointed out. "No, but it might point us toward real proof," Isabel said, a spark of hope kindling in her eyes. "My stepfather isn't very smart when he's been drinking. If he stole those bonds, he might have left a trail." Outside, the shadows were growing longer as full darkness settled over the town. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, 8 o'clock. 16 hours until Deputy Wade's deadline. "I'll go to the saloon," Elias decided. "See what I can learn." "You can't," Mrs. Keene protested. "They're watching the building. The moment you step outside, they'll know you're up to something." She was right, of course. Any attempt to leave would immediately raise suspicion. But sitting here helplessly while Isabel faced the loss of her freedom and her child was unbearable. That was when they heard the soft tap on the window. All 3 adults froze, and even baby Gabriel seemed to sense the sudden tension in the room. The tapping came again, gentle but insistent. Mrs. Keene crept to the window and carefully lifted the edge of the curtain. Her face broke into a smile of relief. "It's Henry," she whispered. "Henry Crow Feather. He's a Ute scout who sometimes works for the territorial government." She unlatched the window and pushed it open. A weathered face appeared in the opening, an older Native American man with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair braided with leather cord. "Heard there was trouble at the boarding house," he said quietly, his English accented but clear. "Thought you might need a friend." "Henry, thank God," Mrs. Keene breathed. "They've arrested Isabel for stealing railroad bonds, but she's innocent. We need to prove it before they take her baby away." Henry's expression darkened. "Wade," he said with obvious distaste. That man has no honor, always quick to arrest the powerless and slow to investigate the powerful. You know something about this? Elias asked, moving closer to the window. I know Wade has been spending money he shouldn't have, Henry replied grimly. New clothes, new horse, new saddle. Deputies don't make enough to afford such things. You think he's involved in the theft? I think Wade is a man who can be bought, Henry said carefully. And I think the person who framed this young woman paid well for his cooperation. The pieces were starting to come together, but they still needed proof. Henry seemed to read Elias's thoughts. There is a way, the scout said slowly, but it would be dangerous. Tell us, Isabel said from the bed, her voice weak but determined. Wade keeps his personal belongings in a strongbox under his desk at the jail, Henry explained. If he's been paid to frame you, there might be evidence of that payment. Breaking into the jail. Elias shook his head. That's suicide. Not breaking in, Henry corrected with a slight smile. Walking in, I still have my territorial scout credentials. Wade doesn't like Indians, but he respects federal authority. I can get inside. Mrs. Keene was already shaking her head. It's too risky, Henry. If they catch you... They won't catch me, the scout said simply. I've been walking through hostile territory without being detected since before that boy was born, but I'll need a distraction. They spent the next hour planning their desperate gambit. Henry would approach the jail after midnight when Wade would likely be asleep in his chair. Meanwhile, Elias would create a distraction at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Nothing dramatic enough to bring Wade running, but sufficient to draw the attention of any other deputies who might be nearby. As the plan took shape, Isabel fed baby Gabriel and tried to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring either salvation or the destruction of everything she held dear. Mrs. Keene prepared a traveling bundle with supplies they might need if they had to flee quickly, and Elias checked his weapons, a knife, a rifle, and the small pistol he kept for emergencies. At 11:30, Henry slipped away from the window like a ghost, leaving barely a whisper of movement to mark his passing. At midnight, Elias prepared to make his own exit through the same window despite Mrs. Keene's worried protests. If something goes wrong, he told Isabel, you run. Take the baby and you run as far and as fast as you can. I won't leave you, she said firmly. You will if you have to, he replied. That child needs his mother more than she needs a washed-up mountain man. Before she could protest further, he was gone, dropping silently from the second-story window to the alley below. The guards posted around the building were watching the doors, not expecting anyone to attempt such an exit. The Silver Dollar Saloon was exactly what Elias had expected, a ramshackle building that reeked of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed humanity. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. A few late-night drinkers hunched over their glasses at the bar, while a tired-looking woman in a faded dress played a melancholy tune on an out-of-tune piano. Elias ordered a whiskey and settled into a corner table where he could watch the room and listen to the conversations around him. He didn't have to wait long. I tell you, it was beautiful, a slurred voice declared from the bar. That little Mexican gal standing up there like she owned the world, even with that rope around her wrists. Elias recognized the voice. It belonged to the tobacco-stained farmer who had been bidding at the auction. The man was clearly deep in his cups, his words running together as he regaled his drinking companions with his version of the day's events. Should have seen the look on her face when that mountain man cut her loose, the farmer continued. Like she couldn't believe someone actually cared enough to help her. Waste of good money, if you ask me, another voice replied. Girl's a thief. Everyone knows it. How's everyone know it? The farmer challenged. You got proof. Don't need proof. Carlos Martinez told everyone his stepdaughter stole them bonds. Man's got no reason to lie about his own family. At the mention of Isabel's stepfather, Elias leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Carlos. The farmer spat into a spittoon. That man's been drunk more days than sober since his wife died. Probably doesn't even remember what happened to them bonds. He remembers enough, a third voice interjected. This one belonged to a thin man with darting eyes, the same one who had called Isabel a thief at the auction. Told Deputy Wade all about how she took them papers right out of his strongbox. What strongbox? The farmer asked with genuine curiosity. Carlos ain't got 2 coins to rub together, let alone a strongbox. The thin man's face flushed, and he suddenly seemed very interested in on his drink. I meant to say, but the farmer wasn't letting it go. You said strongbox, Jimmy. Where would Carlos Martinez get a strongbox? Jimmy's eyes darted nervously around the saloon, and Elias could see the man's growing panic. Maybe I heard wrong. Maybe it wasn't a strongbox. Maybe it was just a drawer or something. Or maybe, the farmer said slowly, his alcohol-fogged brain finally making a connection, you know more about this than you're letting on. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the door, as several men burst in laughing loudly about something that had happened down at the livery stable. In the confusion, Jimmy slipped away from the bar and headed for the back exit. Elias waited a moment, then followed. The alley behind the saloon was dark and narrow, filled with the detritus of frontier life. Jimmy was relieving himself against the back wall when Elias stepped out of the shadows. Nice night for a walk, Elias said conversationally. Jimmy spun around, nearly losing his balance in his haste. What do you want? Just wanted to thank you for the interesting conversation in there, Elias replied, moving closer, especially the part about the strongbox. I don't know what you're talking about, Jimmy stammered, but his eyes gave him away. Sure you do. You know exactly where Carlos Martinez got that strongbox, don't you? Because you're the one who gave it to him. Jimmy's face went white in the moonlight. You're crazy. Let me tell you what I think happened. Elias continued, his voice deadly quiet. I think someone paid Carlos to accuse his stepdaughter of theft. I think that same someone gave him a strongbox with fake evidence inside, maybe some papers that looked like bond certificates, maybe something else that could be used to frame an innocent girl. You can't prove nothing, Jimmy blurted, then immediately looked horrified at his own words. Actually, I think I can, Elias said with grim satisfaction, because I think you just confessed. The sound of approaching footsteps made both men freeze. Henry Crow Feather materialized from the shadows like a spirit, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph. The evidence is in Deputy Wade's strongbox, he reported quietly. Bills of sale for the bonds signed by Carlos Martinez, and a receipt for payment to Carlos for services rendered $500 signed by someone called J. Morrison. Jimmy made a choking sound. That's not J. Morrison, Elias mused. Jimmy Morrison, perhaps. The thin man's resistance crumbled completely. He made me do it, he wailed. Mr. Whitmore said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me. He owns half the businesses in town. Whitmore, Henry repeated grimly. The man who was bidding on the girl at the auction. It all clicked into place. Then the well-dressed stranger's determination to purchase Isabel his fury, when Elias outbid him his presence with Deputy Wade when they came to arrest her. Whitmore had stolen the railroad bonds himself, then paid Carlos Martinez to frame his stepdaughter. When that plan was disrupted by Elias's intervention at the auction, Whitmore had simply accelerated his timeline. Where are the real bonds? Elias demanded. I don't know, Jimmy sobbed. Whitmore never told me. He just said the girl had to take the blame or we'd all go down. A church bell tolled in the distance, 2 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours until Wade's deadline. We need to get back, Henry said urgently, if Wade discovers his strongbox has been opened. They left Jimmy cowering in the alley and made their way back through the shadowy streets. The guards were still in position around the boarding house, but they were tired and inattentive after hours of watching a building where nothing had happened. Elias climbed back through the window to find Isabel awake and nursing Gabriel. Her face brightened with hope when she saw his expression. You found something, she said. We found everything, he replied, and proceeded to tell her what they had discovered. When he finished, tears were streaming down her face, but for the first time since he had met her, they were tears of relief rather than despair. So what do we do now? Mrs. Keene asked practically. We have the evidence, but will anyone believe us? Whitmore is a powerful man in this town. We don't take it to the local authorities, Henry said firmly. We take it to the territorial marshal. He has jurisdiction over railroad crimes, and he has no love for corrupt local officials. The nearest territorial marshal is in Silver Creek, Mrs. Keene pointed out. That's a 2-day ride. Then we better get started, Elias said grimly. But even as they began planning their escape, the sound of heavy footsteps in the street below made them all freeze. Mrs. Keene crept to the window and peered out, then turned back with a pale face. Whitmore's here, she whispered, and he's brought a lot of men with him. The confrontation that would determine all their fates was about to begin. The sound of approaching voices carried through the night air like the rumble of distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second. Miss Keene's face had gone ashen as she peered through the curtain, her fingers trembling against the fabric. How many? Elias asked quietly, moving to check his rifle. At least a dozen, she whispered back. Maybe more. They're surrounding the building. Isabel clutched Gabriel closer to her chest, the baby stirring restlessly, as if sensing the tension that filled the room. Her face was pale but determined, the fierce protectiveness of new motherhood burning in her dark eyes. There's got to be another way out, she said, struggling to sit up straighter, despite her weakness. The roof maybe, or… No, Henry interrupted firmly. You're in no condition to climb, and the baby would never survive it. Besides, they'll have men watching every possible exit by now. The voices below were growing clearer now, harsh and angry tones that spoke of violence barely held in check. Elias could make out Whitmore's cultured accent rising above the others, giving orders with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. Search every room, Whitmore was saying. They're in there somewhere, and I want them found. The woman is a dangerous criminal, and that mountain man is harboring a fugitive. Use whatever force is necessary. Deputy Wade's voice joined the chorus, slurred slightly from whatever he'd been drinking. What about the boarding house owner? Mrs. Keene's been nothing but trouble since this whole business started. She's made her choice, Whitmore replied coldly. Anyone who aids and abets criminals becomes a criminal themselves. Mrs. Keene stepped back from the window, her jaw set in a line of stubborn determination that reminded Elias of his late wife Sarah. Well, she said quietly, I suppose I've been called worse things by better men. The sound of heavy boots on the front porch steps echoed through the building, followed by the crash of the door being kicked open. Mrs. Keene winced at the sound of splintering wood, but didn't flinch from her position beside the window. Ma'am, Wade's voice boomed from the ground floor. This is official business. We know you're harboring fugitives. The only thing I'm harboring is a woman who just gave birth and her innocent child. Mrs. Keene called back, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. And if you have a problem with Christian charity, Deputy Wade, perhaps you should take it up with the preacher. Elias had to admire her courage, even as he cursed the situation that had put this good woman in danger. He moved to Isabel's bedside, helping her to stand despite her obvious weakness. Can you walk? He asked quietly. I'll crawl if I have to, she replied fiercely. I won't let them take Gabriel. The sound of boots on the stairs made them all freeze. Henry had positioned himself by the door, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. His weathered face was calm, but Elias could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled readiness of a man prepared for violence. They're coming, Henry murmured. The footsteps paused outside their door, and Elias could hear the low murmur of voices conferring in the hallway. Then came the sound he'd been dreading, the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. Open up! Wade's voice was harsh with authority and whiskey. We know you're in there. For a moment, The room was silent, except for the soft sound of Gabriel's breathing and the rapid beating of 4 adult hearts. Then Mrs. Keene stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I'm opening the door," she announced, "but I'm warning you, there's a woman and newborn baby in here who need medical care, not harassment from drunken lawmen." She turned the handle and pulled the door open to reveal Deputy Wade, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Elias didn't recognize. Wade's face was flushed from alcohol and anger, his uniform disheveled and his badge hanging crooked on his vest. "Well, well," Wade said with ugly satisfaction. "Look what we have here. The thief, her bastard, the mountain man, and the old squaw lover." Henry stiffened at the slur, but his voice remained level. "Deputy Wade, I didn't expect to see you out so late." "Official business," Wade replied, though his words were slightly slurred. "Seems we have a jailbreak to prevent." "No one's broken out of jail," Elias pointed out quietly. "Your prisoner hasn't even been arrested yet." "Details," Wade waved dismissively. "Point is, this woman is a danger to the community. Stealing from the railroad is a federal crime, and harboring stolen goods makes all of you accessories." "What stolen goods?" Mrs. Keene demanded. "That baby was born here tonight. The only thing that child has stolen is a few hours of sleep from his mother." One of Wade's companions, a thick-set man with scarred knuckles and mean eyes, stepped forward menacingly. "You got a smart mouth for an old woman, and you've got the manners of a pig for someone pretending to be a lawman." Mrs. Keene shot back without flinching. The man's hand moved toward his gun, but Wade held up a restraining hand. "Easy, Briggs. We're here for the girl and the evidence, not to start a war." "What evidence?" Isabel asked, her voice weak but clear. "I haven't stolen anything." Wade's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Your stepfather told us all about it, sweetheart, how you took those railroad bonds right out of his strongbox while he was sleeping off a drunk. $20,000 worth of negotiable securities." "My stepfather doesn't have a strongbox," Isabel replied with quiet dignity. "He can barely afford to keep food on the table." "He does now," the third man spoke up. This one was younger, with shifty eyes and nervous movements. "Got it special for keeping valuable papers safe." Elias studied the young man's face and felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You must be Jimmy Morrison." The man's face went pale. How do you—" "Jimmy," Wade said slowly, his alcohol-fogged brain trying to process this unexpected development. "How does he know your name?" "I had an interesting conversation with Jimmy earlier tonight," Elias said conversationally, "behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. He told me some fascinating things about strong boxes and railroad bonds." Jimmy looked like he was going to be sick. I didn't say nothing. You said plenty," Henry added quietly, "including some very interesting details about who paid Carlos Martinez to frame his stepdaughter." Wade's eyes darted between Jimmy and his companions, a sudden doubt creeping into his expression. "What are you talking about? Jimmy don't know nothing about this business." "Jimmy knows everything about this business," Elias said firmly, "because Jimmy helped orchestrate it, along with his boss, Mr. Whitmore." The name hit Wade like a physical blow. His face went from flushed to pale in an instant, and his hand unconsciously moved toward his gun. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know that Whitmore paid Carlos Martinez $500 to accuse his stepdaughter of theft," Elias continued relentlessly. "I know that Jimmy here delivered the payment and helped set up the false evidence, and I know that you've been bought and paid for since the beginning." That's a damn lie," Wade sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Henry asked mildly. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain the bills of sale in your strongbox, the ones signed by Carlos Martinez acknowledging payment for services rendered." Wade's face went completely white. "How did you— My strongbox is locked, not as securely as you thought," Henry replied with grim satisfaction. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Briggs, the scarred man, looked between Wade and Jimmy with growing suspicion, his hand resting on his gun butt. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Wade, you said this was a simple arrest." "It is a simple arrest," Wade insisted, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "These people are lying. They're trying to confuse you." "The only confusion here," Mrs. Keene said sharply, "is why you're taking the word of a drunk and a thief over that of a young mother who's never hurt anyone in her life." Jimmy was backing toward the door, his face a mask of panic. "I got to go," he mumbled. This wasn't supposed to." "Nobody's going anywhere," Briggs barked, drawing his gun. "I don't know what kind of game you people are playing, but it ends now." The room exploded into chaos. Henry moved like lightning, his knife appearing in his hand as he lunged toward Briggs. Wade fumbled for his own weapon, cursing as his alcohol-impaired reflexes betrayed him. Jimmy bolted for the door, shoving past Mrs. Keene in his panic to escape. Elias threw himself between the gunman and Isabel, his own pistol clearing leather with practiced speed. "Get down," he shouted, pushing Isabel toward the floor behind the bed. Briggs's gun roared in the confined space, the bullet splintering the wooden headboard inches from where Isabel had been standing. Gabriel began crying his infant wails, adding to the cacophony of shouts and curses that filled the room. Henry grappled with Briggs, the two men locked in a deadly embrace as they fought for control of the gun. Wade had finally managed to draw his weapon, but he was swaying dangerously on his feet, clearly unable to aim with any accuracy. "Stop!" Mrs. Keene commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Stop this madness right now." But it was too late for words. Briggs had managed to break free from Henry's grip and was bringing his gun around toward Elias. There was murder in his eyes and death in his intention. Elias's pistol spoke first. The sound was deafening in the small room, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Briggs staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain before collapsing against the wall. His gun clattered to the floor, unfired. Wade stared at his fallen companion with horror, his own weapon wavering in his unsteady grip. "You killed him," he whispered. "You killed a lawman." "I killed a man who was trying to murder an innocent woman and her baby," Elias corrected grimly. "There's a difference." From downstairs came the sound of running feet and shouting voices. Whitmore's men had heard the gunshot and were responding with the swift efficiency of experienced fighters. The brief respite was over. The real battle was about to begin. "How many bullets do you have?" Henry asked quietly, checking Briggs's body for additional weapons. "Not enough," Elias replied honestly. "Not for what's coming." Mrs. Keene had moved to comfort Isabel, who was curled protectively around her crying baby. The young mother's face was pale with shock, but her eyes still burned with fierce determination. "We can't stay here," she said through gritted teeth. "They'll kill us all." "The roof," Henry said suddenly. "There's a ladder to the attic in the back hallway. From there we can reach the roof of the next building." "You said yourself that Isabel couldn't make that climb," Mrs. Keene pointed out. "That was before they started shooting," Henry replied grimly. "Sometimes impossible becomes necessary." The sound of boots on the stairs was getting closer, accompanied by harsh voices and the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied for use. Wade stood frozen in the middle of the room, his gun still pointed vaguely in their direction, but his face slack with shock and indecision. "Wade," Elias said quietly, "you've got a choice to make. You can keep following Whitmore's orders and end up dead or in prison, or you can help us get to the truth." I don't..." Wade's voice trailed off as the magnitude of his situation began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged brain. "They're using you," Isabel said softly, her voice barely audible over Gabriel's crying. "Whitmore and his men are using you to cover up their own crimes. When this is all over, do you really think they'll let you live to testify about what you know?" The truth of her words seemed to hit Wade like a physical blow. His gun hand dropped to his side, and for the first time since Elias had met him, the deputy looked like what he really was, a weak man who had gotten in over his head. "They said it would be simple," Wade mumbled. "Just arrest the girl, hold her for trial. They said she was guilty." "You know she's not," Henry said firmly. "You've known it all along." "But the evidence—" "Fake evidence," Elias interrupted. "Planted by Jimmy Morrison on Whitmore's orders. You've seen the bills of sale in your own strongbox. You know where that evidence really came from." Wade's shoulders sagged as the last of his resistance crumbled. "What do you want me to do?" "Help us get out of here alive," Mrs. Keene said simply. "Help us get to someone who can actually deliver justice instead of just taking bribes." The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. Voices were conferring in the hallway, planning their assault on the room. Time was running out fast. "There's a back staircase," Wade said suddenly. "Leads down to the kitchen. If you can make it that far." "What about you?" Elias asked. Wade looked down at Briggs's body, then back at the group of people who had become unlikely allies in the span of a few minutes. "I'll tell them you went out the window, buy you some time." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. Henry helped Isabel to her feet while Mrs. Keene gathered the bundle of supplies she had prepared earlier. Elias checked his weapons one more time, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. "Ready?" he asked. Isabel nodded, clutching Gabriel close to her chest. Despite her obvious pain and exhaustion, her jaw was set with determination. "Ready." They moved toward the door in single file, Henry leading the way with his knife ready, followed by Isabel and Mrs. Keene with Elias bringing up the rear. Wade positioned himself beside Briggs's body, arranging the scene to support his planned deception. The hallway was empty but full of shadows that could hide enemies. From the front of the building came the sound of men organizing for an assault, their voices harsh with anticipation of violence. Henry gestured for silence and led them toward the back staircase, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life avoiding detection. They had almost reached the stairs when a door opened behind them. "There they are!" The shout echoed through the hallway like a war cry. "Back here, they're trying to escape." All pretense of stealth avoided, they ran. Henry took the stairs 3 at a time, with Mrs. Keene and Isabel close behind. Elias paused at the top of the staircase, turning to face their pursuers with his pistol raised. 2 men came around the corner at a dead run, guns already drawn. Elias fired twice, the bullets chipping splinters from the wall beside their heads. The men dove for cover, giving him the precious seconds he needed to follow the others down the stairs. The kitchen was a chaos of overturned furniture and scattered pots as Mrs. Keene led them toward the back door. But as they reached it, the door burst open to reveal 3 more of Whitmore's men, their faces grim with deadly intent. "Going somewhere?" the leader asked, with a cold smile. They were trapped, caught between the men behind them and the ones blocking their escape route. Gabriel's crying filled the kitchen, a sound of innocence in a place where innocence was about to die. That was when Mrs. Keene stepped forward, a cast-iron skillet in her hands. "Yes," she said calmly, "we're going somewhere, and you're going to let us pass." The man's smile widened. "And why would we do that, old woman?" "Because," Mrs. Keene replied, "I've been cooking for boarders for 30 years, and I know exactly where to hit a man to put him down for good." She swung the skillet with surprising speed and devastating accuracy. The leader collapsed with a grunt of pain, clutching his head. The other 2 men stared in shock at their fallen comrade, giving Henry the opening he needed. The Ute scout moved like a force of nature, his knife flashing in the lamplight as he engaged the remaining men. Mrs. Keene grabbed a rolling pin and waded into the fight with the ferocity of a mother bear protecting her cubs. "Go!" Elias shouted to Isabel. "Out the back door, now!" She stumbled through the doorway and into the night. Gabriel pressed against her shoulder. Elias followed, pausing only to fire a warning shot at the men coming down the stairs behind them. The alley behind the boarding house was narrow and dark, filled with refuse barrels and stacked firewood. Isabel was already 20 yards ahead, moving with desperate determination despite her obvious pain. Miss Keene and Henry emerged from the kitchen behind Elias, both breathing hard but uninjured. "This way," Henry called, pointing toward a gap between two buildings. "We can reach the stable." They ran through the maze of back alleys that connected Millbrook's business district, their footsteps echoing off the wooden walls of the buildings around them. Behind them, shouts and gunfire announced that Whitmore's men were in pursuit. The livery stable was dark and quiet, filled with the comforting sounds of horses and the smell of hay and leather. Henry immediately began saddling horses, while Mrs. Keene helped Isabel into the relative safety of an empty stall. "How far to Silver Creek?" Elias asked as he kept watch at the stable door. "2 days hard riding," Henry replied, tightening the cinch on a sturdy-looking mare. "But they'll be following us." "Then we'll have to outrun them," Isabel said firmly. Despite her exhaustion, her voice was steady with resolve. "Whatever it takes." The sound of approaching voices made them all freeze. Whitmore's men had found their trail and were closing in fast. Henry handed the reins of the saddled horses to Elias and Mrs. Keene while he prepared a mount for himself. "We need a head start," Elias said grimly. "I'll hold them off while you get Isabel and the baby clear." "No," Isabel said sharply. "We stay together, all of us." "She's right," Mrs. Keene agreed. "We've come this far as a team. We finish it as a team." Henry swung into his saddle and helped Mrs. Keene mount behind him. Elias lifted Isabel and Gabriel onto the mare, then climbed up behind them. The baby had finally stopped crying, apparently lulled by the motion and his mother's warmth. "Ready?" Henry asked. The stable door burst open just as they spurred their horses forward. Gunfire erupted behind them as they thundered out into the night, the sounds of pursuit already beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare began, they were moving forward instead of simply reacting to their enemy's plans. The moon was setting behind the mountains as they rode hard toward the east, toward Silver Creek and the hope of justice. The night air was cold against their faces, and the horses' hooves beat a rhythm of desperate flight against the packed earth of the road. "How long before they catch up?" Mrs. Keene called over the wind. "Depends on how organized they are," Henry replied, "and how badly Whitmore wants us dead." As if in answer to his question, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats echoed across the prairie behind them. Whitmore's men were mounted and moving fast, their voices carrying on the night air like the howls of hunting wolves. Isabel tightened her grip on Gabriel and leaned closer to Elias. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "promise me you won't let them take him." "I promise," he replied, meaning every word. "I promise." The chase had begun in earnest now. A race across the frontier landscape where the stakes were life and death, justice and corruption, hope and despair. Behind them rode the forces of greed, and power ahead lay the uncertain promise of law and order. And somewhere in between, a young mother held her newborn son close and prayed that love would prove stronger than hatred, that truth would triumph over lies, and that the dawn would bring not just light, but salvation. The thundering hoofbeats behind them grew steadily louder as their horses strained against the darkness, foam beginning to fleck the animals' necks despite the cool night air. Elias could feel Isabel's body trembling with exhaustion against his chest, but her grip on Gabriel never wavered her maternal instincts, proving stronger than her physical weakness. "There," Henry called out, pointing toward a cluster of rocks jutting up from the prairie about a mile ahead. "We can make a stand there if we have to." "How many are following us?" Mrs. Keene shouted over the wind, her gray hair whipping free from its pins as their horse galloped across the uneven ground. Elias risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his heart sink. At least 8 riders were visible in the moonlight, spread out in a wide line to prevent any attempt at escape to either side. Whitmore was taking no chances this time. "Too many," he called back grimly, "and they're gaining ground." The pursuing riders had better horses, fresher mounts, that hadn't been standing idle in a stable all evening. It was only a matter of time before they were overtaken, and when that happened, there would be no mercy shown. Whitmore had too much to lose now to leave any witnesses alive. "The baby," Isabel gasped, her voice barely audible over the pounding of hooves. "If something happens to me, promise me you'll take Gabriel somewhere safe, somewhere far from here." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Elias replied fiercely, though he could see the blood seeping through her dress where the exertion had reopened wounds from the difficult birth. "We're all getting out of this alive." But even as he spoke the words, he knew their situation was desperate. The horses were beginning to labor, their breathing harsh and ragged in the thin air. Behind them, their pursuers showed no signs of slowing, their voices carrying across the prairie like the calls of hunting wolves closing in on wounded prey. Henry's mount stumbled slightly, a brief misstep that cost them precious yards. The Ute Scout immediately pulled up, allowing the others to draw alongside him. "My horse is going lame," he reported tersely. "Stone bruise, I think. She won't last much longer at this pace." Mrs. Keene's face was pale but determined in the moonlight. "Then we make our stand at those rocks. At least we'll have some cover." "Against 8 armed men." Elias shook his head. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Henry admitted, "but running on a lame horse is certain death, and they'll catch us long before we reach Silver Creek." The sound of a rifle shot echoed across the prairie, the bullet whining overhead like an angry wasp. Their pursuers were close enough now to take ranging shots, testing the distance and their own marksmanship while riding at full gallop. "Decision time," Henry said quietly. Elias looked down at Isabel, who was fighting to stay conscious, despite her blood loss and exhaustion. Gabriel had somehow managed to fall asleep again, his tiny face peaceful and trusting against his mother's shoulder. The sight of that innocent trust made something harden inside Elias's chest, a resolve as cold and unyielding as mountain stone. "The rocks," he decided. "We make our stand there." They turned their horses toward the rocky outcropping, pushing the exhausted animals for one final burst of speed. Behind them, their pursuers let out a triumphant shout as they realized their quarry was no longer trying to outrun them. The rocks formed a natural fortress of sorts, a jumbled pile of granite boulders that rose about 20 feet above the surrounding prairie. There were gaps between the stones that could provide cover, and several positions that offered a clear field of fire back toward the approaching riders. They reached the base of the rocks with perhaps 2 minutes to spare. Henry's horse was limping badly now, her left foreleg clearly injured. There was no question of riding her any further. "Get Isabel into the rocks," Elias ordered, sliding down from their mount. "Find the best defensive position you can." Mrs. Keene was already helping the young mother down, supporting her weight as Isabel's legs nearly buckled beneath her. The older woman's face was grim with worry as she saw the extent of blood loss that was becoming evident in the moonlight. "She needs a doctor," Mrs. Keene said urgently. "Soon. She needs to live through the next hour first," Henry replied, checking his weapons. "Then we can worry about doctors." The approaching riders had slowed their pace now that their quarry was cornered, spreading out in a wide semicircle to surround the rocky outcropping. Elias could see Whitmore himself among them, his expensive clothes making him stand out even in the dim light. "You've got nowhere to run now," Whitmore's voice carried clearly across the distance between them. "Send out the woman and the child, and maybe we'll let the rest of you live. Go to hell." Mrs. Keene's voice rang out from among the rocks, sharp with defiance. Whitmore's laugh was cold and humorless. "You're in no position to negotiate, old woman. You're harboring a thief and a murderer. The territorial government will thank us for cleaning up this mess." Elias had found a good position between 2 large boulders that gave him a clear view of the approaching men while providing cover from return fire. He could see Henry positioning himself about 20 yards away, his rifle resting on a granite shelf. Mrs. Keene had gotten Isabel settled in a protected hollow near the center of the rock formation where falling bullets would be least likely to find them. "Last chance," Whitmore called out. "Send out the woman or we come in shooting." "She's innocent," Elias shouted back. "And you know it. You're the one who stole those railroad bonds." "Prove it," came the mocking reply. "You've got no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but the word of a thief and her accomplices." But even as Whitmore spoke those words, another voice cut through the night air, a voice that made everyone freeze in surprise. "Actually, they've got all the evidence they need." From the darkness beyond the circle of riders came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, moving fast and with purpose. Whitmore's men wheeled their horses around trying to identify this new threat, their guns swinging toward the unknown riders. "Hold your fire," the new voice commanded with unmistakable authority. "This is United States Marshal John Crawford. You men are interfering with a federal investigation." 3 riders emerged from the shadows, their badges glinting in the moonlight. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much violence not to recognize its approach. His companions flanked him on either side, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. Whitmore's face went pale as he recognized the marshal. "Crawford," he said carefully, "this is a local matter. These people are wanted for theft and murder." "Are they?" Marshal Crawford's voice was deceptively mild. "Because I've got a very different story here. According to the telegram I received from Deputy Wade about 3 hours ago, you're the one who's been stealing from the railroad." Elias felt a surge of amazement. Wade had come through after all, had found the courage to contact the federal authorities despite his own involvement in the corruption. "Wade's a drunk and a liar," Whitmore said desperately. "You can't believe anything he says." "Maybe not," Crawford agreed, "but I can believe the evidence he turned over. Bills of sale in your handwriting payment receipts signed by Carlos Martinez, and a very detailed confession from one Jimmy Morrison about his role in framing an innocent woman." Jimmy Morrison, the nervous young man who had fled the boarding house, was apparently not as loyal to Whitmore as his employer had believed. "This is preposterous," Whitmore blustered. "I demand to see this so-called evidence." "You'll see it," Crawford replied grimly, "at your trial for theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder, along with any of your men who choose to keep following your orders." The circle of riders was beginning to waver, the men looking nervously between their employer and the federal marshal. These were hired guns, not idealists, and they had no interest in dying for a cause that was already lost. "You heard him, boys," one of the riders called out. "Federal charges. That means federal prison. I ain't spending the rest of my life breaking rocks for Whitmore's money." The man wheeled his horse around and spurted into the darkness, abandoning his employer without a backward glance. 2 others immediately followed his example, leaving Whitmore with only 5 supporters. "Cowards!" Whitmore screamed after the departing riders. "I'll see you all hang for this betrayal." But his words carried no weight now. The remaining men were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized the odds had shifted dramatically against them. "It's over, Whitmore," Marshal Crawford said firmly. "Order your men to lay down their weapons and surrender peacefully. Maybe some of them can avoid the gallows." For a moment, it seemed as though Whitmore might actually comply. His shoulders sagged and his head dropped as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his arrogance and desperation. Then his hand flashed toward his gun. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking that Mexican whore and her bastard with me." He spurred his horse directly toward the rocks. Where Isabel was hidden, his pistol clearing leather with surprising speed for a man more accustomed to boardrooms than gunfights. His remaining followers, caught up in their leader's final desperate charge, came right behind him. Elias's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking one of the riders clean out of his saddle. Henry's weapon boomed a split second later, dropping another horse and sending its rider tumbling across the rocky ground. Marshal Crawford and his deputies opened fire from the other side, their bullets cutting down 2 more of Whitmore's men before they could close the distance to the rocks. But Whitmore himself seemed to bear a charmed life, weaving through the crossfire with desperate skill as he drove his horse toward Isabel's hiding place. "No!" Elias roared, abandoning his covered position to intercept the charging man. He launched himself from between the boulders, tackling Whitmore from his saddle just as the man's gun swung toward the hollow where Isabel cowered with her baby. The two men hit the ground hard, rolling across the sharp stones as they grappled for control of the weapon. Whitmore was stronger than his soft appearance suggested desperation, lending him a ferocity that matched Elias's mountain-hardened strength. They rolled back and forth among the rocks, each man trying to gain advantage over the other, while the pistol wavered between them. "You should have minded your own business," Whitmore gasped as they struggled. "Should have let me buy the girl and been done with it." "Never," Elias replied through gritted teeth. "Some things aren't for sale." The gun went off between them, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off a granite boulder, but the muzzle flash had burned Elias's hand, weakening his grip enough for Whitmore to partially break free. The businessman rolled away, bringing his pistol up toward Isabel's position once more. His face was twisted with murderous rage, the mask of civilized respectability finally stripped away to reveal the savage greed beneath. "She's going to die," he panted. "The baby too, and it's all your fault." His finger tightened on the trigger just as another shot rang out across the night. Whitmore's eyes widened in shock and pain as he looked down at the spreading red stain across his chest. His gun hand wavered, then dropped as his strength failed him. Marshal Crawford stood among the rocks, his smoking pistol still aimed at the fallen man. His face was grim but satisfied as he watched Whitmore collapse onto the cold stone. "That's for threatening an innocent woman and her child," the marshal said quietly. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader down and faced with federal lawmen who had already proven their willingness to shoot, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The brief, violent confrontation was over as suddenly as it had begun. Elias rushed to Isabel's side, finding her conscious but pale with shock and blood loss. Gabriel was still sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, apparently undisturbed by the gunfire and violence that had erupted around him. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," he confirmed gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe now, both of you." Mrs. Keene had already begun tending to Isabel's wounds, using strips torn from her own petticoat to stanch the bleeding. Her experienced hands moved with sure efficiency, born of decades of caring for sick and injured boarders. "She needs proper medical attention," the older woman reported to Marshal Crawford. "Soon. We'll get her to Silver Creek," the marshal promised. "Doc Harrison is the best physician within 200 miles. She'll be in good hands." Henry emerged from his position among the rocks, his rifle still ready but no longer needed. The Ute scout's dark eyes surveyed the scattered bodies of Whitmore's men with professional detachment. 5 dead, 3 captured, he reported tersely. "The threat is eliminated." Marshal Crawford nodded with satisfaction. "Good. We'll need the survivors for testimony at the trial." He turned to Elias with a look of respect. "You did well tonight, Mountain Man. Not many would have stood up to Whitmore and his crew." "I had good reason," Elias replied, his hand resting gently on Isabel's shoulder. The marshal's eyes took in the tender gesture, the protective way Elias positioned himself between Isabel and any potential threat. A slight smile crossed his weathered features. "I can see that," he said quietly. As dawn began to break over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the group prepared for the journey to Silver Creek. Marshal Crawford had brought a wagon specifically to transport Isabel, safely having anticipated her condition from Deputy Wade's telegram. Mrs. Keene fussed over the arrangements, making sure Isabel was as comfortable as possible for the trip. Blankets and pillows were arranged in the wagon bed, creating a makeshift but serviceable bed for the injured young mother. "This reminds me of when my own children were born," she said softly as she helped settle Isabel into the wagon. "Seems like a lifetime ago now." Thank you, Isabel said simply, for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped us. Nonsense, Mrs. Keene replied briskly. Any decent person would have done the same. The real heroes here are these men who were willing to fight for what's right. Henry had managed to catch one of the riderless horses, a sturdy gelding that showed no signs of injury despite the night's adventures. He swung into the saddle with fluid grace, his weathered face already scanning the horizon for potential threats. The trail to Silver Creek is clear, he reported. We should make good time if the weather holds. Elias climbed into the wagon beside Isabel, his rifle across his knees, and his eyes constantly moving to check for danger. The events of the past day had forged an unbreakable bond between them, a connection that went deeper than mere shared adversity. As the wagon began to roll across the prairie, Isabel shifted closer to him, seeking the comfort of his solid presence. Gabriel stirred against her shoulder, his tiny eyes opening to look up at the vast sky above them. Look, she whispered, pointing upward. He's seeing his first sunrise. The baby's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the endless expanse of blue stretching from horizon to horizon. Somewhere high above them, a hawk circled lazily on the warming air currents, its cry echoing across the grassland like a song of freedom. What happens now? Isabel asked quietly. Now we clear your name officially. Marshal Crawford called from his position riding alongside the wagon. Wade's confession and Morrison's testimony should be enough to convince any jury of your innocence. The charges against you will be dropped. And after that, Elias looked down at her, seeing the uncertainty in her dark eyes. She had been through so much in such a short time: betrayal by her stepfather, false accusations, the trauma of giving birth while in captivity, and finally the violence of the past night. Now she faced an uncertain future as a single mother with no family support and no place to call home. After that, he said gently, you build a new life, somewhere safe, somewhere you can raise Gabriel in peace. Where? The question was barely a whisper. Elias was quiet for a long moment, watching the endless prairie roll by under the wagon wheels. He thought of his cabin in the mountains, isolated and peaceful, surrounded by clean air and clear streams. He thought of the long, lonely nights since Sarah's death, when the silence had seemed to press down on him like a physical weight. And he thought of the way Isabel had looked when she held her newborn son, the fierce love and protectiveness that had shone in her eyes despite her exhaustion and pain. I have a place, he said finally. Up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's safe, peaceful, good place to raise a child. You're offering us a home, she asked, not daring to hope. I'm offering you sanctuary, he corrected gently, for as long as you need it. No conditions, no expectations, just a safe place to heal and decide what you want to do with your life. Tears gathered in Isabel's eyes, but for the first time in days they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks, Elias replied. Just promise me you'll give yourself time to heal, both of you. Mrs. Keene, who had been listening to their conversation from her seat at the front of the wagon, turned around with a knowing smile. Healing has a way of bringing people together, she observed. Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances. As the wagon continued its steady progress toward Silver Creek, the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, burning away the last shadows of the terrible night they had all endured. Behind them, the scene of violence and corruption was already being reclaimed by the prairie grass and the wind. Ahead lay the promise of justice, of peace, and perhaps something even more precious, the chance for two wounded souls to find healing in each other's company, bound together by shared adversity and the innocent trust of a child who represented hope for the future. Gabriel had fallen asleep again, his tiny fist curled around one of Isabel's fingers with the absolute trust that only the very young possess. In that simple gesture lay all the reason they had needed to fight all the justification for the risks they had taken. The baby was safe. His mother was free. And somewhere in the mountains a new family was about to be born from the ashes of tragedy and the triumph of love over hatred. The courthouse in Silver Creek stood like a monument to frontier justice, its weathered wooden walls bearing witness to countless trials where truth and lies had battled for supremacy. As the wagon carrying Isabel and Gabriel rolled to a stop before its imposing entrance, a crowd had already gathered on the steps, drawn by word that the railroad bond scandal was finally coming to light. Dr. Harrison had worked his healing magic over the past 3 days, and while Isabel was still pale and moved carefully, she had insisted on attending the trial despite his protests. Gabriel slept peacefully in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket that Mrs. Keene had somehow managed to acquire during their stay in town. "You don't have to do this today," Elias said quietly as he helped her down from the wagon. "Your testimony can wait until you're stronger." "No," Isabel replied with quiet determination. "I want this finished. I want Gabriel to grow up knowing his mother's name was cleared by truth, not just time." Marshal Crawford approached them with a satisfied expression, a thick folder of documents under his arm. "Jimmy Morrison sang like a canary in springtime," he reported. "We've got enough evidence to convict a dozen men. Whitmore's whole operation is laid bare." "What about Deputy Wade?" Mrs. Keene asked, adjusting her best hat as she prepared to enter the courthouse. "He'll testify in exchange for a reduced sentence," Crawford replied. 5 years instead of 20. Not bad for a man who helped frame an innocent woman, but his cooperation is worth something. Henry Crowfeather had cleaned up for the occasion, trading his buckskins for a simple but respectable suit that somehow made him look even more dignified than usual. His dark eyes surveyed the crowd with the instinctive wariness of a man who had learned not to trust mobs. "Many people," he observed quietly, "some friendly, some not." Indeed, the crowd was a mixed gathering. There were those whose faces showed genuine sympathy for Isabel's ordeal, but others bore the hard expressions of people who still believed that where there was smoke, there must be fire. The whispers that followed their progress up the courthouse steps carried both support and suspicion in equal measure. "Look at her acting all innocent," one woman muttered loud enough to be heard. "Mexican girls like that are born knowing how to lie." "Hush your mouth, Emma Carlyle," another voice shot back sharply. "That poor child has been through enough without your poisoned tongue making it worse." Elias felt his jaw tighten at the first woman's words, but Isabel placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let it go," she said softly. "Words can't hurt us now. The truth is about to speak louder than any whisper." Inside the courthouse, Judge William Hartley presided with the gravitas befitting a man who had spent 30 years dispensing justice on the frontier. His white beard and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of Old Testament authority, and his reputation for fairness was known throughout the territory. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We are here to examine the charges against Miss Isabel Martinez and to determine the truth regarding the theft of $20,000 in railroad bonds from the territorial office." The prosecutor, a thin man named Collins, who had arrived from the territorial capital specifically for this case, rose to address the court. His face was grim as he shuffled through his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the case had taken. "Your Honor," Collins began reluctantly, "in light of new evidence that has come to light, the territorial government wishes to withdraw all charges against Miss Martinez. We have compelling proof that she was wrongfully accused of crimes committed by others." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Judge Hartley's sharp gaze silenced it immediately. "Mr. Collins, this court requires more than your word regarding such serious charges. Present your evidence." What followed was a methodical dismantling of the case against Isabel. Jimmy Morrison, pale and shaking, took the stand and confessed his role in the conspiracy. His voice was barely audible as he described how Whitmore had pressured him into helping frame an innocent woman. He said it would be simple, Morrison whispered, not daring to look toward where Isabel sat in the gallery. Just plant some fake evidence, pay off her stepfather to accuse her. Said nobody would care what happened to a pregnant Mexican girl with no family. And what was your payment for this deception? Collins asked. $500, Morrison replied, shame evident in every syllable. More money than I'd ever seen at one time. Deputy Wade's testimony was even more damaging to the conspiracy. The former lawman, his badge confiscated, and his uniform replaced by simple civilian clothes, described in detail how Whitmore had approached him about arresting Isabel. He came to me about a week before the auction. Wade testified, his voice slurred slightly, but his words clear enough. Said there was a theft coming to light, and he wanted to make sure the right person got blamed for it. Did you question the evidence he provided? Judge Hartley asked. Wade's face reddened. I should have, but he was offering good money and times were hard. The railroad had cut back on their security contracts, and my pay was 3 months behind. So you accepted money to arrest an innocent woman? Yes, sir, Wade admitted quietly. God help me, I did. When Marshal Crawford took the stand, he presented the physical evidence that sealed the case. Bills of sale in Whitmore's handwriting, payment receipts, and most damning of all, the real railroad bonds found hidden in Whitmore's personal safe. The bonds were never stolen by Miss Martinez, Crawford testified. They were taken by Jacob Whitmore himself, who then orchestrated an elaborate scheme to frame an innocent woman for his crime. And what became of Mr. Whitmore? The judge inquired. He died resisting arrest, Crawford replied simply. He chose to go down fighting rather than face justice in this courtroom. Carlos Martinez, Isabel's stepfather, was brought in shackles to testify about his role in the conspiracy. The man who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating now looked like what he truly was, a broken-down drunk who had sold his own family for silver. She's my stepdaughter, he mumbled, when asked to identify Isabel. Good girl, never gave me no trouble. Then why did you accuse her of theft? Collins pressed. Carlos's shoulders sagged. The money. Whitmore offered me enough to drink for a year, said all I had to do was tell a story about finding some papers missing. Did you believe Miss Martinez was guilty of the crime you accused her of? No, Carlos admitted, his voice barely audible. I knew she was innocent, but I needed the money more than I needed my conscience. The testimony that moved the courtroom most deeply came from Mrs. Keene, who described the night of Gabriel's birth and the courage Isabel had shown throughout her ordeal. I've delivered more babies than I can count, the older woman testified, her voice strong and clear. But I've never seen a woman show more grace under pressure than that child did. She was scared and in pain, facing false charges and the loss of her baby, but she never once wavered in her dignity. In your opinion, was Miss Martinez capable of the crime she was accused of? Collins asked. That girl couldn't steal a penny candy from a jar without her conscience eating her alive, Mrs. Keene replied firmly. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with her would know she's incapable of such deception. Henry Crowfeather's testimony provided the technical details of how the evidence had been discovered and preserved. His reputation as an honest scout was well known, and his quiet dignity impressed even those in the courtroom who harbored prejudices against Native Americans. The evidence was clear, he testified in his careful English. Miss Martinez was innocent of all charges. The real criminals used her as what you call a scapegoat, someone to blame for their own crimes. When it came time for Isabel herself to testify, a hush fell over the courtroom. She rose gracefully, Gabriel sleeping peacefully in her arms, and walked to the witness stand with her head held high. Despite her youth and the trauma she had endured, there was something regal about her bearing that commanded respect. Miss Martinez, Collins began gently, please tell the court about your relationship with your stepfather. "He was my mother's husband," Isabel replied, her voice clear and steady. "After she died, I stayed to keep house for him because I had nowhere else to go. He drank heavily and was often cruel, but he was the only family I had left." "Did you ever have access to any railroad bonds or securities?" "No, sir. I barely had access to enough food to keep from starving. My stepfather spent what little money we had on whiskey." "Tell us about the night you were arrested." Isabel's voice remained steady as she recounted the events leading up to her sale at auction, but Elias could see the pain in her eyes as she relived those terrible hours. "I knew I was innocent," she concluded, "but I also knew that nobody would believe the word of a pregnant Mexican girl against respected white men. I thought my baby and I were going to die separated and alone." "What changed that?" Judge Hartley asked gently. For the first time, Isabel's composure wavered slightly as she looked toward where Elias sat in the gallery. "A good man decided that justice was more important than the color of my skin or the circumstances of my birth." The judge followed her gaze to Elias, studying the mountain man's weathered face with keen interest. "Mr. Kane, please approach the bench." Elias rose and walked to the front of the courtroom, feeling every eye upon him. He had never been comfortable as the center of attention, preferring the solitude of his mountain cabin to the scrutiny of crowds. "Mr. Kane," Judge Hartley said, "you spent a significant sum to purchase Miss Martinez's freedom at auction. What motivated this action?" "She asked for help," Elias replied simply. "When someone asks for help and you have the power to give it, you give it. That's what decent people do." "You had no prior relationship with Miss Martinez?" "No, sir. I'd never seen her before that day." "Yet you risked your life and spent your life savings to help a stranger." Elias glanced toward Isabel, who was watching him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sometimes strangers become family faster than blood relatives. Miss Martinez and her son have become my family, and I'll protect my family with my last breath." A murmur of approval ran through parts of the courtroom, though some faces remained skeptical. Judge Hartley studied Elias for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Your actions speak well of your character, Mr. Kane. This court commends your courage and integrity." The final testimony came from Dr. Harrison, who had examined Isabel upon her arrival in Silver Creek. His medical evidence confirmed the timeline of Gabriel's birth and supported her claims about the trauma she had endured. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Harrison testified, "Miss Martinez had recently given birth and was suffering from significant blood loss and exhaustion. She was in no condition to have committed any crimes, and her primary concern throughout her treatment was the welfare of her child." When all the testimony was concluded, Judge Hartley called for a brief recess to consider the evidence. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as people tried to process everything they had heard. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, but frontier justice could be unpredictable, influenced as much by prejudice and politics as by facts. Elias found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curiosity seekers, but his attention remained focused on Isabel, who sat quietly nursing Gabriel in a corner where Mrs. Keene had arranged some privacy. "You did well up there," he told her softly. "Your mother would have been proud. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day." She replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gabriel and I would both be dead by now." "But you're not," Elias said firmly. "You're alive, you're free, and you have a future ahead of you. That's what matters now." Marshal Crawford approached them with a satisfied expression. "The judge is ready to render his verdict." The courtroom filled quickly as word spread that Judge Hartley was about to announce his decision. Isabel returned to her seat, Gabriel now awake and looking around with the bright curiosity of a healthy baby. The silence was so complete that the baby's soft gurgling sounds seemed to echo off the walls. Judge Hartley entered and took his seat, his expression grave but not unkind. He surveyed the packed courtroom for a long moment before speaking. "This case has revealed a web of corruption and deceit that strikes at the very heart of justice." He began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. We have heard testimony that proves beyond any doubt that Miss Isabel Martinez was the victim of a conspiracy designed to destroy an innocent woman for the profit and convenience of corrupt men. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. The evidence shows that Jacob Whitmore, with the assistance of James Morrison, Carlos Martinez, and Deputy Wade, orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal $20,000 in railroad bonds and frame Miss Martinez for the crime. This conspiracy was motivated by greed and enabled by prejudice against a young woman whose only crimes were being poor, pregnant, and Mexican. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably at the judge's blunt assessment. However, Judge Hartley continued, this case has also revealed the best of human nature. We have seen ordinary people rise above prejudice and self-interest to protect the innocent and seek justice. Mrs. Keene, Henry Crow Feather, and especially Elias Kane demonstrated the courage and integrity that represent the finest traditions of our territory. Elias felt his face redden at the public praise, but Isabel reached over and squeezed his hand, her touch warm with gratitude. Therefore, the judge declared, this court finds that all charges against Miss Isabel Martinez are dismissed with prejudice. She is declared innocent of all wrongdoing and is free to go with the court's apology for the injustice she has suffered. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and grumbling, but the sound of Judge Hartley's gavel quickly restored order. Furthermore, he continued, Carlos Martinez is sentenced to 2 years in territorial prison for conspiracy and perjury. James Morrison will serve 1 year and pay restitution to Miss Martinez in the amount of $1,000. Deputy Wade, in consideration for his cooperation, is sentenced to time served plus community service under the supervision of Marshal Crawford. The judge paused, his eyes finding Isabel in the crowd. Miss Martinez, this court extends its formal apology for the injustice you have suffered. You have shown remarkable grace and dignity throughout this ordeal, and you should hold your head high as you move forward with your life. Tears were streaming down Isabel's face now, but they were tears of relief and vindication. She stood slowly, Gabriel in her arms, and bowed slightly toward the judge. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Justice has been served. As they filed out of the courthouse, Isabel found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and support. Many of the same townspeople who had whispered cruel things about her before the trial now seemed eager to show their approval of the verdict. Miss Martinez, called out the woman who had defended her earlier, I hope you'll accept my invitation to Sunday dinner. It's the least we can do after what you've been through. Others echoed similar invitations, but Elias could see the exhaustion in Isabel's eyes. The trial had drained what little strength she had regained, and Gabriel was becoming fussy from all the attention. Thank you all for your kindness, Isabel said diplomatically, but I think we need some quiet time to let this all settle in. Mrs. Keene, ever practical, had already arranged for their transportation back to the boarding house where they had been staying. As they climbed into the wagon, she fussed over Isabel like a mother hen. You need rest and a good meal, she declared. All this excitement isn't good for a nursing mother. That evening, as they sat around the fireplace in Mrs. Keene's parlor, the full impact of their victory began to sink in. Gabriel slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle, finally safe from the threats that had shadowed his first days of life. What happens now? Isabel asked the question that had been haunting her since the judge's verdict. Now you heal, Mrs. Keene said firmly, both in body and spirit, and then you decide what kind of life you want to build. The offer still stands, Elias said quietly. My cabin in the mountains, it's peaceful there, good for raising a child. You'd be safe. Isabel studied his face in the firelight, seeing the sincerity in his dark eyes. Over the past week, she had come to understand that this was a man who meant what he said, whose word was as solid as the mountains he called home. You've already done so much for us, she said softly. I can't ask you to uproot your whole life. You're not asking, he replied. I'm offering, and it wouldn't be uprooting my life, it would be starting a new one. The honesty in his words made her heart skip a beat. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the growing feelings between them, the connection that had been forged in crisis and strengthened by shared adversity. Elias, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the emotions churning within her. I know it's too soon, he said gently. You've been through too much to make any big decisions right now. All I'm asking is that you give yourself time to heal and let me help you do it. No pressure, no expectations, just a safe place for you and Gabriel to figure out what comes next. Mrs. Keene cleared her throat delicately. If I may offer an old woman's perspective, she said, sometimes the best decisions are the ones that feel right in your heart, even when your head says it's too soon. Henry, who had been quietly smoking his pipe in the corner, spoke up for the first time that evening. Among my people, he said slowly, we believe that some souls are meant to find each other, no matter how dark the path that brings them together. The spirits have been kind to you both. Isabel looked down at Gabriel, who had awakened and was staring up at her with his impossibly wise eyes. This innocent child deserved a chance at happiness, at a life free from the shadows of prejudice and corruption that had marked his birth. I'd like to see your mountains, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. They're beautiful this time of year, he said, especially at sunrise when the peaks catch the first light. Gabriel would like that, I think, she replied, returning his smile. He seems to enjoy looking at the sky. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Gabriel began to fuss, and Isabel lifted him to her shoulder. The baby immediately settled against her warmth, one tiny fist curled around a strand of her dark hair. He trusts you, Elias observed, his voice soft with wonder. Even after everything that's happened, he still trusts the world to be good to him. Children are born believing in goodness, Mrs. Keene said wisely. It's only adults who teach them to be afraid. Then we'll make sure Gabriel never has to learn that lesson, Isabel said with quiet determination. We'll make sure he grows up believing the world is a place where good people help each other, where justice prevails, and where love is stronger than hatred. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, their light cold and distant, but somehow comforting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about their future together. But tonight, for the first time since Gabriel's birth, they could rest in the knowledge that they were safe, that justice had been served, and that the worst was finally behind them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cozy parlor. 4 adults and 1 baby, brought together by circumstances that none of them could have imagined, now found themselves bound by something stronger than blood, the shared experience of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As Gabriel drifted off to sleep in his mother's arms, surrounded by the quiet conversation of the people who had become his unlikely family, the future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and hope. The journey to Elias's mountain cabin took 3 days of gentle travel with frequent stops to allow Isabel to rest and nurse Gabriel. Mrs. Keene had insisted on accompanying them for the first week, claiming she needed to ensure Isabel's full recovery, though everyone suspected the older woman had grown too attached to simply say goodbye. Henry rode ahead as their scout and guide, his keen eyes watching for any signs of trouble, though Marshal Crawford had assured them that the remnants of Whitmore's organization had scattered to the 4 winds after their leader's death. Still, caution had become second nature to all of them. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers instead of dust and desperation. Isabel found herself breathing more deeply than she had in months, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders with each mile they put between themselves and the corruption of Millbrook. It's beautiful, she said softly as they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. So peaceful. Wait until you see the cabin, Elias replied, his voice warm with pride and anticipation. It sits in a meadow surrounded by aspens. In the fall, when the leaves turn, it looks like the whole world is made of gold. Gabriel had become the perfect traveling companion, sleeping peacefully through most of the journey and greeting the rare stops with bright-eyed curiosity. The mountain air seemed to agree with him, and his tiny cheeks had gained a healthy pink glow that made Mrs. Keene beam with maternal satisfaction. Look at him, she said as they paused beside a crystal-clear stream to water the horses. Strong as a little bear cub already, mountain life is going to suit this one perfectly. The cabin, when they finally reached it late on the third afternoon, exceeded even Elias's proud descriptions. It was larger than Isabel had expected, built of solid pine logs, with a wide front porch that faced east toward the valley. Wildflowers grew in casual profusion around the foundation, and a vegetable garden showed signs of careful tending despite Elias's prolonged absence. Sarah planted those flowers, Elias said quietly, noticing Isabel's admiring gaze. She said a home should welcome visitors with beauty, not just shelter. The mention of his late wife brought a moment of awkward silence, but Isabel broke it with characteristic grace. She had excellent taste. Gabriel and I are honored to be welcomed by such beauty. Inside, the cabin was simply but comfortably furnished with handmade wooden furniture that spoke of hours of careful craftsmanship. The main room centered around a massive stone fireplace, while a well-equipped kitchen occupied one corner. 2 bedrooms and a small study completed the layout. You and Gabriel can have the larger bedroom, Elias said, carrying their few belongings inside. I'll take the smaller one. Mrs. Keene can use the study while she's here. This is far too generous, Isabel protested. We're imposing on your hospitality. You're not imposing, he replied firmly. You're healing. There's a difference. Mrs. Keene bustled around the cabin like a woman who had found her calling, making beds with sheets that smelled of mountain lavender and organizing the kitchen with military efficiency. This place just needs a woman's touch to make it truly shine, she declared with satisfaction. That first evening, as they sat around the fireplace sharing a simple but hearty meal, the conversation turned to practical matters. Winter would come early in the mountains, and there were preparations to be made if Isabel and Gabriel were to stay beyond the first snowfall. The nearest town is Pine Ridge, Elias explained. About a day's ride down the mountain. There's a doctor there and a general store, a school for when Gabriel's older. And neighbors, Mrs. Keene asked practically. The Andersons have a ranch about 5 miles south. Good people. They've got 3 children and always need help with harvest. The Reverend Thomas has a small church in Pine Ridge, rides up here once a month for services. Isabel listened to these descriptions with growing wonder. After years of isolation and suspicion, the idea of being part of a real community seemed almost too good to be true. They won't mind, she asked hesitantly. About me being Mexican, unmarried. Mountain people judge by character, not bloodline, Henry said from his position by the window, where he kept casual watch over the surrounding forest. They'll see your strength and kindness. That's all that matters here. The next morning brought visitors as if summoned by their conversation. Tom Anderson arrived with his wife Mary and their 3 children, carrying fresh bread and a pot of venison stew as welcome gifts. Heard you had company, Elias, Tom said with a warm smile. Thought we'd come by and make introductions. Mary Anderson was a practical woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Isabel and Gabriel and immediately assumed the role of helpful neighbor. Oh, what a beautiful baby, she exclaimed, gently touching Gabriel's tiny hand. And you must be exhausted, dear. Moving with a newborn is no easy task. Mrs. Anderson, Isabel began formally, but Mary waved away the attempt at formality. Call me Mary, please. We're neighbors now, and neighbors don't stand on ceremony. Now let me see what I can do to help you get settled." The Anderson children aged 6 to 12 were fascinated by the baby and peppered Isabel with questions about his feeding schedule, sleeping habits, and whether he could play yet. Their innocent acceptance of her presence was both heartwarming and healing. "Can we help teach him things when he gets bigger?" asked Sarah, the eldest. "I'm real good with babies. Ma says I'm a natural." "I'm sure Gabriel would love that," Isabel replied, touched by the girl's eagerness to include him in their mountain community. Tom pulled Elias aside for a quiet conversation about practical matters, where to find the best hunting, which meadows would provide the most hay for winter feed, and how to prepare the cabin for the harsh mountain storms that would arrive in a few months. "You thinking of making this permanent?" Tom asked, directly, his eyes taking in the way. Elias watched Isabel with protective tenderness. "I'm thinking of letting time tell us what's right," Elias replied carefully. "She's been through enough without pressure from me." "Sometimes," Tom said wisely, "the best things happen when we stop overthinking and start trusting our hearts." Over the following weeks, a routine developed that felt as natural as breathing. Elias spent his days hunting, fishing, and maintaining the cabin, while Isabel focused on recovering her strength and caring for Gabriel. Mrs. Keene appointed herself general supervisor of everyone's welfare, cooking elaborate meals and offering unsolicited advice on everything from child rearing to matters of the heart. "That man is in love with you," she announced one morning as she and Isabel worked in the garden while Gabriel napped in a basket nearby. "Anyone with eyes can see it." "It's too soon," Isabel replied, though her cheeks colored slightly. "I can't make decisions about love when I'm still recovering from trauma." "Love doesn't follow schedules," Mrs. Keene said pragmatically. "It comes when it comes, whether convenient or not. The question is what you plan to do about it." Isabel paused in her weeding, her hands resting on the warm earth. "I care for him deeply," she admitted quietly. "He saved Gabriel's life and mine. He's given us a home when we had nowhere to go, but I don't know if what I feel is love or just gratitude." "Time will tell the difference," Mrs. Keene said with certainty. "But don't let fear make the decision for you. You've both suffered enough loss for one lifetime." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Reverend Thomas, a spare man in his 50s with gentle eyes and a voice that carried the authority of deep faith. He had ridden up from Pine Ridge specifically to meet Isabel and offer his support. "I heard about your trials in Silver Creek," he said as they sat on the front porch, watching Gabriel play with a colorful rattle Mrs. Keene had made from dried gourds. "I wanted to ensure you knew that our community stands ready to welcome you with open arms." "Thank you, Reverend," Isabel replied, touched by his kindness. "I've found more acceptance here in a few weeks than I knew in years of living in town." "Mountain communities are different," the Reverend explained. "We understand that survival depends on helping each other regardless of where we came from or what we look like. Character matters more than ancestry up here." He paused, studying Gabriel with the fond expression of a man who had baptized dozens of babies over the years. "I'd be honored to baptize this little one when you're ready. Give him a proper welcome into our community of faith." Isabel felt tears prick her eyes at the offer. After months of being treated as an outcast, the simple kindness of these mountain people was almost overwhelming. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "Gabriel deserves to grow up feeling welcomed and loved." As autumn deepened and the aspen leaves turned to molten gold, Isabel's strength returned fully. She began taking longer walks around the mountain meadows, Gabriel strapped securely to her chest in a carrying sling that Mary Anderson had taught her to make. These solitary times gave her space to think about her future and the growing feelings in her heart. Elias had been nothing but respectful and patient, never pressing her for more than friendship, while making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that his feelings ran much deeper. He carved wooden toys for Gabriel, brought her wildflowers from his hunting expeditions, and listened with genuine interest to her thoughts about everything from child rearing to the beauty of the changing seasons. "He's a good man," she said to Gabriel during one of their walks, the baby's bright eyes watching the golden leaves dance overhead. "Your father would have approved of him, I think. He would have wanted someone strong and kind to help me raise you." The mention of Gabriel's biological father brought the familiar pang of loss, but it was gentler now, softened by time and the healing power of mountain air. She had loved Raphael deeply during their brief time together, but she was beginning to understand that the heart had room for more than one love, that honoring the past didn't mean closing herself off to the future. Mrs. Keene announced her intention to return to Silver Creek as the first snow began to dust the higher peaks. "You don't need an old busybody watching over you anymore," she declared, though her eyes were suspiciously bright as she packed her belongings. "You're not a busybody," Isabel protested. "You're family, Gabriel's first grandmother and the woman who helped bring us together. All the more reason to know when to step aside," Mrs. Keene replied practically. "Some conversations need to happen without an audience." The night before Mrs. Keene's departure, they held an impromptu celebration dinner with the Andersons and Reverend Thomas as guests. The cabin was filled with laughter and warmth as stories were shared and friendships deepened. Gabriel, now 3 months old, charmed everyone with his bright smiles and curious babbling. "He's going to be a heartbreaker," Mary Anderson predicted, bouncing the baby on her knee. "Look at those eyes. He's going to have the mountain girls wrapped around his little finger." "Not for many years." Isabel laughed, but she felt a warm pride at seeing her son so completely accepted by their new community. After their guests departed, Elias helped Mrs. Keene load her belongings into the wagon that would take her back to Silver Creek. The older woman had insisted on traveling with a merchant caravan for safety, though everyone knew the real dangers were long past. "Take care of them," she told Elias quietly as they secured her trunk. "With my life," he promised, "and take care of yourself too," she added with a knowing look. "You deserve happiness, son. Don't be afraid to reach for it." The next morning dawned crisp and clear with frost covering the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Isabel stood on the porch watching Mrs. Keene's wagon disappear down the mountain trail, Gabriel in her arms, taking in the spectacle of his breath, making small clouds in the cold air. "Just the 3 of us now," Elias said quietly, joining her on the porch. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "About us being here, I mean." "Never," he replied with such conviction that she felt her doubts dissolve. "This place has felt more like home in the past month than it has in 3 years. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the eastern peaks. Gabriel had fallen asleep against Isabel's shoulder, perfectly content in the warmth of her arms and the peaceful rhythm of the morning. "Elias," Isabel said finally, her voice soft but determined. "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious and attentive. "I know I said it was too soon, that I needed time to figure out my feelings." She continued, her heart beating rapidly, but her voice steady. "But these weeks with you have shown me something important. What I feel for you isn't gratitude or convenience or desperation, it's love. Real, honest, choose you every day love." His face lit up with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "Isabel," he said softly, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I know we come from different worlds." She rushed on, needing to say everything before her courage failed. "I know people will talk about the mountain man and the Mexican woman who lived in sin before they married, but I also know that Gabriel needs a father, and I need a partner, and you're the only man I can imagine building a life with." "Are you asking me to marry you?" he asked with a grin that transformed his usually serious features. "I'm asking if you'd want to marry someone like me," she replied, her cheeks flushing pink. "Someone with a complicated past and a baby and more baggage than a traveling merchant." Instead of answering with words, Elias stepped closer and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. Isabel Martinez, he said solemnly. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Your past isn't baggage, it's proof of your courage. Gabriel isn't a complication, he's a blessing, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life loving both of you. Is that a yes? She whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That's a yes to everything, he replied, and leaned down to kiss her with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them for months. Gabriel chose that moment to wake up and let out a small cry of protest at being pressed between them. They broke apart, laughing, the baby's timing perfect as always. I think he approves, Isabel said, settling Gabriel more comfortably in her arms. He better, Elias replied, reaching out to stroke the baby's soft cheek. He's going to be stuck with me as a father. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the meadow behind the cabin, with golden aspen leaves carpeting the ground like nature's own bridal train. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the mountain air as he spoke of love, commitment, and the power of redemption. Tom and Mary Anderson served as witnesses, their children acting as an impromptu choir, with voices that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Henry Crow Feather had returned for the occasion, bringing with him a traditional Ute blessing for the new family. Gabriel, dressed in a tiny suit that Mary had sewn specially for the occasion, slept peacefully through most of the ceremony, waking only during the exchange of vows to add his own soft babbling to the proceedings. Do you, Elias Kane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife to love and cherish through all the seasons of life? Reverend Thomas asked. I do, Elias replied, his voice strong and certain as he looked into Isabel's eyes. I take her not just as my wife, but as my partner, my equal, and the mother of my children. And do you, Isabel Martinez, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor through all of life's challenges? I do, she replied, her voice clear, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. I take him as my husband, my protector, and the father Gabriel has been waiting for. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the mountains themselves seemed to celebrate, sending back echoes of the cheers and applause from their small gathering of friends. Elias kissed his bride with a passion that made the Anderson children giggle and the adults smile with satisfaction. As they walked back toward the cabin, Gabriel, wide awake now and fascinated by all the activity, Isabel marveled at how far they had all traveled from that terrible day at the auction block. The frightened, desperate girl who had begged for someone to buy her had become a confident woman walking toward her future with her head held high and her heart full of hope. Any regrets? Elias asked as they paused on the porch to look back at their wedding guests enjoying the celebration feast Mary had organized. Only one, Isabel replied, shifting Gabriel to her hip so she could slip her arm around her new husband's waist. What's that? That it took so much pain to bring us together, she said softly. I wish we could have found each other under happier circumstances. Maybe, Elias said thoughtfully, but would we have recognized what we had if we hadn't been tested by fire? Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst. Gabriel reached up and grasped a strand of Isabel's hair, his tiny fist holding on with the determined grip that had characterized him since birth. He looked between his mother and his new father with the wise eyes that had captivated everyone who met him, as if he understood perfectly that his family was now complete. He knows, Isabel said with wonder. Look at him, he knows he's home. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the new family stood together on their porch, overlooking the valley that would watch their children grow, their love deepen, and their legacy take root in mountain soil. The winds that had once carried whispers of scandal and hatred now sang songs of redemption and hope through the aspens. What had begun with a desperate cry from an auction block had transformed into something beautiful and eternal, a love forged in adversity, tested by corruption and proven stronger than hatred. A family born from the ashes of injustice had found their sanctuary in the mountains where the only judge that mattered was the one who measured hearts instead of bloodlines. Gabriel Martinez Kane would grow up knowing that sometimes angels come disguised as broken mountain men, that courage can triumph over corruption, and that love really can conquer all, because he had lived proof of it in the story of how his parents found each other when the world tried its hardest to keep them apart. In the end, that was all any child needed to know, that he was loved, completely protected fiercely, and destined for a future as bright and endless as the mountain sky above their heads. The rest was just details that time would sort out one blessed day at a time.